So Jared, tell me how you first found out about your cancer.
I was just finished my 5th year exams for medicine, and 2 weeks after that we planned to travel to Nepal, then do some travelling around the Middle East, go down to Kenya, climb Kilimanjaro, and then spend 2 months in northwest Zambia working in a hospital for my elective. So it was about kind of a 2.5, 3 month trip planned. And literally 1 week after I finished my exams and 1 week before we were supposed to depart, I got essentially a sort of gut pain that sort of came and went every 5 to 30 minutes and would last 30 seconds to a minute each time. And it came and went for a few days. And I kind of ignored it for a little bit, but I lost my appetite and my bowel motions had stopped. And then after the 3rd day of that, I started vomiting, at which point we were wondering what was going on, and certain medical warning signs went off. And we went into the hospital, and we sat there for 6 hours before we got seen. Then we got put under conservative management, which really means sit and watch for another couple of days. And meanwhile, during this time, I was kind of bloating out and still hadn't eaten, still hadn't passed any bowel motions, and they did some more x-rays and found I had a bowel obstruction. There's a saying in medicine that you never let the sun go down on a bowel obstruction. And I was in theatre for 3.5 hours, and I came out at about 11:30 that night out of theatre and discovered that it was a tumour in part of my colon, which is called the hepatic flexure, and they'd removed about 35 centimetres of colon along with this tumour and some other areas that it spread to. Interestingly, the first thing I did when I was coming out of my general anaesthetic was said to my wife, "Was it my appendix?" And she said no, and I said, "Well, what was it?" She goes, "I don't want to say, I'll let the surgeons tell you." And I said, "Well, was it a tumour?" That was the next thing that came to my mind. And I barely remember it because I was still groggy from the anaesthetic. And she replied, "Yes, it was." We got the histology back 6 days later, and it was confirmed as a cancer. And that had spread beyond the bowel as well. And the things that go through your mind, I mean, there's kind of disbelief. I kept repeating the phrase, "who would have thought," over and over. I was 27 at the time. I got discharged from hospital on my 28th birthday. And we'd only been married 11 months. You know, you were in your 20s, I guess, you're at an age where you more or less think you're invincible. And it was just kind of, I guess, sort of, it was the disbelief initially and then coming to terms with it over time.
So what stage are you at the moment?
Essentially what's happened since then is the first 6 months of last year I had chemotherapy starting in January and finished in June. That was pretty rough. That was first line treatment. My prognosis at the beginning of that was a 40% survival at 5 years with chemotherapy. Without chemotherapy it would have been about 20% survival at 5 years. The chemotherapy finished in June. My wife and I decided to travel around Asia for 2 months just for a holiday, for a break. I had to take the whole year off from medicine, and we got back and I had a follow-up scan in October, and it showed that it had come back. Showed that there were some nodes that had turned up that weren't there before, and they were growing fairly fast, which is kind of as bad as it gets prognostically. I asked the oncologist at the time, "What does this mean for 5-year survival?" And his reply was, "Well, we don't really talk about 5-year survivals in this situation anymore. We talk more like 2-year survivals." So I started chemotherapy again in December and have just finished my 3rd round. This was a different regime. It's every 2 weeks. I've also made the decision to go back to med school because initially the idea was to delay med school for a year, but now that there's no definite end in sight, I've decided to go back and do medicine anyway and try and fit it around the chemotherapy as much as possible.
What does the chemo do to you? Because it's quite tough, isn't it?
Yeah, this regime is different from the last regime. The last regime was very tough. One particular drug called oxaliplatin is very neurotoxic, so you get a lot of neurological effects. I still don't have sensation in the tips of my fingers from it, although it has improved. But I used to cramp at cold, and I couldn't drink cold water because my whole throat would spasm up. It was just very, very unpleasant, and it would take about 5 or 6 days for that to wear off after each round. And that's also on top of the nausea and the tiredness, massive tiredness. This particular regime seems to be dominated by the one that I'm on now. Fatigue, nausea, acid reflux, starting to get some hair loss and thinning out a little bit. It's 50-50 as to whether I lose it all or just thin out. And diarrhea, the other ones, the symptoms I just have to manage the most.
What does the future hold?
Well, best case scenario for myself, if I respond to the second line chemotherapy, I have 2 to 3 years of life left. Worst case scenario, if I don't respond, if it's a non-responding cancer to the second line, could be measured in months. I may not be alive this time next year.
You seem very positive about things. Where's that coming from?
For me, my life is about giving glory to God, regardless of my circumstance. And just because I've been dealt this particular set of cards, I don't see why it's an excuse to feel sorry for myself and to stop honouring God in that process. And so out of that, I've really chosen to engage with people around me through family, community, friends, and share about my experience and what God's doing through it. And it's created a positive experience out of what it is that I'm going through. I think a big part of it has just been submitting all of this to God and really just saying, God, I know that regardless of the outcome, whether I get 5 years or 50 years, this is still in your hands. And by being able to submit that, there's a huge release in that process and a massive amount of peace that comes out of it. And that's not an easy process. That's something I have to do on a daily basis, more than once a day often. But it's a process that definitely brings about peace, and I've never genuinely felt angry at God about this.